Hello, you're watching Context, and I'm Orkhan Amashov here to ask some relevant and pertinent questions in pursuit of illuminating and elucidating answers. And today I have a couple of questions to ask, of course, and the major news of the day is the meeting of President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan and Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan of Armenia in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. This meeting is indeed very important. It is taking place against a backdrop of very important developments within the region and beyond the region being of global significance. Quite a number of analysts have been mentioning the truly bilateral nature of this meeting. In fact, Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process has been bilateral since late 2023, and there have been a couple of meetings of bilateral nature since that point onwards. We remember 7th of December joint statements, which was the result, the product of the bilateral process, negotiations between the sides. Of course, those who are keeping PDI on Azerbaijani-Armenian dynamics remember meeting on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference in February 2024, when German Chancellor provided the platform, but the subsequent discussions were of bilateral nature. We remember bilateral meetings between the foreign ministers of two countries, of course. We also remember some of the meetings on the sidelines of big congregations. For example, on the 15th or 16th of May, actually, President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan met in Tirana, Albania, on the sidelines of the 6th EPC meeting. But this meeting is very, very different. Backdrop is incredibly important, and the outcomes are eagerly anticipated. And today I'm going to discuss this very important meeting, which many analysts describe as a beginning of the qualitatively new stage in Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process. With my guest, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Vasif Huseynov, head of the department at the Center for Analysis of International Relations, based in Baku. Vasif, what a great honor to welcome you in the studio.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much indeed, Vasif. First of all, let's look at what is happening. So, meeting is still underway. We are receiving reports on a regular basis. We saw the leaders, we saw the footage, President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan together with their respective delegation members. Then there was a news that we received saying that meeting was over, but it's not over. It's just second round started. And so it looks like a very extensive meeting. What's your reading?
You know, indeed it is a very important historic moment in Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process. For the past 3 decades, it's the first time that the sides bilaterally organize an event. You mentioned that the two leaders have already met in several occasions, and also foreign ministers held bilateral meetings. But it is the first time that Armenia-Azerbaijan sides bilaterally prepared, organized a meeting at the highest level without the participation, facilitation, mediation of third parties. I remember a couple of times, for example, when European Union organized meetings between the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan. President Charles Michel left the meeting room several times, let the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan talk to each other directly. But it is the very historic moment that today the sides bilaterally organized, cooked an event, a meeting, and they came together to discuss the future of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations, normalization process. And indeed, there are a lot of issues on the agenda to discuss, and that's the reason why I'm not surprised that the meeting has been going on still. It has not concluded yet, according to reports. And it shows that the issues that are being discussed are very extensive. And also, another very important point is the fact that Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process, overall Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict was never just a matter of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. It had always geopolitical dimensions, external dimensions, because we are located in a region which is enormous geopolitical importance. And recently in an article I mentioned that, in Mackinder's terminology, the Eurasia is heartland of geopolitics, and I would add that the South Caucasus is heart of the heartland.
Yes,
and we are now in Abu Dhabi. The leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan are discussing on the fate of this heartland. The future of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations are going to determine the future of the South Caucasus and the balance of power, which has already shifted in the region. Now, the new regional order is being emerging. And today, the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan are discussing this. And one more point I would like to add, if we talked about bilateral meetings, it's very important to consider, to remember that it was Azerbaijan who initiated bilateral track of negotiations. And initially, the Armenian side was very unhappy about that. Even Armenian analysts were saying that as Azerbaijan is in a stronger position, want to talk to Armenia bilaterally in order to control, manipulate the whole agenda. But eventually the Armenian side itself came to the conclusion that the bilateral meetings, bilateral track of negotiations are the best option to discuss the peace process and the future of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. It shows that Armenia has already accepted this peace vision of Azerbaijan, and now the two leaders, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and President Ilham Aliyev, have come together finally in a meeting that organized bilaterally, and we are very hopeful about this meeting, its outcomes. Also, it has already been reported that we don't expect any significant breakthrough. Any document or peace treaty is unlikely to be signed during this meeting, but still the fact that this meeting took place is very important. And I would like to add one more thing to this equation. If you remember, in December last year, when President Aliyev talked about Armenia-Azerbaijan relations, he said that the peace treaty is being discussed, but there are several obstacles, like the deployment of European monitoring mission to Armenia's borders, Minsk Group, constitutional impediments in Armenia. But since that time, it looks like, also 6 months passed, but it feels like more than several years passed in the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process, as what we achieved over the past 6 months cannot be underestimated. In March this year, bilaterally again, in the bilateral track of negotiations, we succeeded to conclude the text of peace treaty, which is very important. Previously, the analysts in both Armenia and Azerbaijan were saying that the peace treaty could be signed by the end of the year, when they were talking in 2023 or 2024. But at that time, there was not a ready text to be signed. But now we have it. In March this year, we succeeded to finalize the text of peace treaty. And also now the leaders are going to most likely build upon this. But there are many issues to be discussed in this context.
Thank you, Vasif. And my colleagues informed me about the initial embryonic sort of preliminary outcomes of this meeting, and they effectively conform to what we just said. Effectively, of course, no agreement is to be signed soon, but as we understand, this is the beginning of the process, a quality renewal process, and you explained the true bilateral nature of this particular meeting, its fundamental attributes, and it looks like the sides will be continuing their contact. This level of contact will continue. They discussed a number of issues. All the tracks have been discussed, all of them. So border delimitation, demarcation, one track. Second track, of course, the opening of communications, Zangezur Corridor specifically. Peace agreement related matters, the confidence building measures. So the preliminary outcomes emanating from Abu Dhabi suggests that yes indeed, something is in the offing. I discussed this subject with Armenian Pashinyan and Zangezur Corridor just a couple of days ago, 2 days ago to be more precise, and the key focus there was about the nature of breakthrough. What we can define, establish as a breakthrough. What is breakthrough? What may sound or look like a breakthrough for one analyst may appear to be something very trivial for another person. Therefore, of course, we will be listening, we will be reading those lines coming from Abu Dhabi. We will try to analyze those preliminary outcomes, but they are actually preliminary. Of course, something else may come up. Do you expect something like post-meeting joint statement? You remember back in those days when the process was trilateral, usually, for example, when Charles Michel was mediating between President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan, there was a post-meeting statement by Charles Michel with points, and on the basis of that we were establishing for ourselves what has been attained. Do you expect something like joint statement?
First let me comment on your question on the nature of breakthrough. In order to understand what kind of breakthrough might come out of this meeting, first we have to get clear understanding what are the problems, what are the obstacles that have prevented the signing of peace treaty until this point. And these issues are clear. I followed your programs here. You have discussed it extensively, constitutional impediments, Minsk Group, as well as the Zangezur Corridor. A couple of days ago, Hikmet Aliyev, presidential advisor in Azerbaijan, talked about the peace treaty process, and he emphasized that Azerbaijan's expectations about the constitutional change in Armenia and the removal of territorial claims against Azerbaijan from the constitution of Armenia is still there.
Yeah.
It's very important because in the context of the recent peace treaty negotiations, some analysts in Armenia and also abroad discussed the possibility of Azerbaijan's, changing its mind and withdrawing its demand.
You don't expect that. You don't expect.
I don't expect it, and Mr. Aliyev has already reaffirmed Azerbaijan's position that constitutional change is still a valid requirement of the Azerbaijani side. Armenia has to remove territorial claims against Azerbaijan from its constitution in order to show that this conflict will never strike back. Unfortunately, today there are many revanchist forces in Armenia who denounce the peace treaty negotiations and who vote that if they ever come to power in Armenia, they will reverse all these agreements between Azerbaijan and Armenia and start all these territorial claims again.
Just allow me to interject here. It is the information about the meeting being held in a very constructive atmosphere, and information related to preliminary results are actually coming from the government sources. It's official information. So something from government sources. So we do have a certain degree of certainty what has been attained, and those preliminary results indicate that atmosphere was quite constructive. Discussions were substantial. The subject matter was related to all the three tracks, and that discussion will continue at all levels from now on. So.
It is not surprising to see Armenia and Azerbaijan have been able to come to this constructive, positive atmosphere, considering the recent geopolitical developments in the region. It is also something very new in the Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. For the first time in the post-Soviet period, it looks like the position, the interests of Azerbaijan and Armenia in geopolitical terms are converging, in the sense that Armenia now understands there are external actors who try to pursue divide and rule strategy in the South Caucasus, creating this conflict, manipulating it, undermining peace process, and using it as a leverage against both Armenia and Azerbaijan. And as they have come to this conclusion, they have started to demonstrate more constructive position. And it is one of the reasons why...
It's very interesting, Vasif. If you remember, discussions after 2020 were trilateral. They had been trilateral for some considerable time, up to late 2023. You recall that Brussels meeting in April 2022, after which, if you recall, foreign ministers spoke by phone. That many analysts used to describe it as an embryonic emergence of bilateral format, because there was a first contact, direct contact between them. And then, of course, we remember other meetings throughout 2022. We remember August meeting of 2022, but they were still trilateral, of course. And then 2023, when the beginning of that year, the trilateral Brussels format was on the verge of collapse. We remember that United States interfered, and then Armenia recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity in May with exact figures, so with square kilometers mentioned. But it was only in late 2023 that bilateral format sort of emerged, and that emerged after Azerbaijan fully restored its sovereignty over the rest of the Karabakh. Was that the main factor sort of inducing Armenia into bilateral negotiations? Because before that point, the key Armenian, the element of the Armenian reasoning was that we don't trust each other, therefore mediator is an absolute must. But back then in late 2023, after the removal of Karabakh subject from the agenda, Armenia itself started to talk more about the necessity of bilateral meeting. How do you interpret that particular moment in Azerbaijan-Armenian dynamics?
I think it was triggered by the collapse of separatist regime in Karabakh. It was a very decisive moment, a turning point in Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process. Until that time, there was a sense of urgency in Azerbaijan because the separatist regime was posing national security threats against Azerbaijan. They were carrying military supplies from Armenia and elsewhere through Zangezur Corridor. It was killing Azerbaijani people. Landmines brought to Karabakh regime from Armenia, even after Second Karabakh War, were posing significant threats. And at that time, Azerbaijani government was trying to use all the potential. It doesn't matter it was bilateral, trilateral, or quadrilateral, all the potential to resolve the problem. It was a very significant
I even recall quinquepartite meeting in Chisinau.
Exactly. So, but as we succeeded to put an end to separatist regime in Karabakh in September 2023, the situation changed dramatically for Azerbaijan. Now Azerbaijan started to feel safer. We were and still are in complete control of our borders. And therefore now the Azerbaijani government started to take the negotiations with more sense of relaxation, or that there was not that
urgency. The sense of urgency seemed to have slackened a bit after September 2020.
Exactly. And it was a turning point. Mm-hmm. And the Armenian side as well came to the conclusion that they needed a peace treaty due to various reasons, both domestic and geopolitical. And that's why the demands of the Azerbaijani side started to be taken much more seriously by the Armenian government. And this is the reason why now we managed to bring all these negotiations to completely bilateral format. I have seen a couple of analysts even discussing here with you as well, talking about the intervention of the United States, of Trump administration. I wouldn't say that Trump administration has been that much effective or influential in the peace process over the past six months. Basically, despite the fact that Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, once talked with Prime Minister Pashinyan, there has been no talk with President Aliyev yet. And it shows that United States, I know that Rubio recently talked about peace treaty prospect between Azerbaijan and Armenia, saying that hopefully it will be signed soon. But the effective participation of the United States in the process has not been visible. And therefore, I personally believe that what happened over the past 6 months and what's happening today in Abu Dhabi is the outcome of these bilateral negotiations. Some events, some meetings between the representative of two countries were not visible to public eye, but from some sources we learned that, there were official meetings, and basically the two sides were cooking today's high-level summit. And therefore, it is very significant event in the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process, and I believe that it is the beginning of larger developments, particularly peace.
It's very interesting about the nature of this meeting. It is purely bilateral in a sense that you don't have a host country welcoming guests saying that we wish peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and then leaving the room. Because previously, last year, 2024, on the sidelines of Munich Security Conference, the German Chancellor sort of convened the meeting, expressed his best wishes, and then left the room. And the President Aliyev, together with his delegation members, and the Prime Minister Pashinyan, started to talk about the peace process. And then there was a bilateral meeting between foreign ministers of two countries, but there was still one host country representative welcoming and then leaving afterwards. And then there was another meeting, if you remember, in Kazakhstan of similar nature, and then foreign ministerial meeting, of course, not at the level of the leaders. And there was one sort of particular format, which was about third country providing venue, but not acting as a mediator, but still sort of being present.
Exactly.
And then we were saying that it doesn't really matter. That kind of meetings could take place in Berlin, in Munich, in Astana, in different parts of the world. But this one looks absolutely different in terms of being completely direct, completely.
Yeah, and which is the reason why it is taking place in a geopolitically neutral country. Right. From our sources, we learned that it was the initiative of Azerbaijan side to host the meeting, to hold the meeting in Abu Dhabi, and the Armenian government agreed with that proposal. It's very important because it is not a Western country, it is not Russia, it's not Central Asia.
It's not even a Central Asian country.
It is a geopolitical neutral country, and it is also very important in the context of these negotiations.
I mean, how do you think Russia will react to these developments? Yesterday with Ahmad Ali, director of the Cox Policy Analysis Center, we were, as with your good self, were reflecting on the past. When I referred to the competition of the platforms, I remember when President Aliyev met with Pashinyan Prime Minister Pashinyan in October in Prague. Then there was a meeting in Sochi. We remember that Russia was sort of in a certain way reacting to the results of the Prague meeting, saying that, if you remember what President Putin said at the Valda Discussion Club, effectively criticizing Armenia for recognizing Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. And we know that Prague results were confirmed in Sochi. So there was a sort of a competition between different platforms. My question to you is the following. Do you think, bearing in mind Russia's geopolitical luggage, its interest in the region, and particularly bearing in mind uneasy relationship between Baku and Moscow at present, and in view of what's going inside Armenia, there could be some sort of maneuver coming from the Kremlin?
There is a fact that Russia is not as powerful as in the South Caucasus as it used to be before. The Ukraine conflict has significantly diminished Russia's geopolitical influence in other territories of former Soviet states and also elsewhere. And it is being affecting the situation in the South Caucasus as well. Russia is basically withdrawing from the region reluctantly. It is the reason why we see today's development in Armenia. Armenia's shift in foreign policy towards the West was unprecedented in the post-Soviet period. And it is, of course, affecting the situation regarding the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process as well. One important fact is very necessary to point out. The trilateral document, which was signed after the Second Karabakh War, was a document that included Russia as well as a stakeholder in the future security order in the South Caucasus, and primarily as the side which was supposed to provide security of the Zangezur Corridor. Today it is changing. Whether Russia is going to react it aggressively is a big question on everybody's mind. But personally, I don't think that the present developments are leading to some sort of confrontation between Russia on the one side, Armenia and Azerbaijan on the other side. Remember what happened in September 2023. At that time, for a lot of people, it was surprising that Russia did not stop Azerbaijan taking over the separatist regime, destroying it, and completely restoring its sovereignty over the international recognized territories of Azerbaijan. And also in April last year, when Russia withdrew its peacekeeping forces from Karabakh, a lot of observers, both in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and elsewhere, were expecting that Russia was going to react it aggressively, because that was the end of Russia's military influence, military presence in Azerbaijan, and basically it was the end of Karabakh project itself. It is something Russian Empire created.
You mentioned Vasif.
Let me finish it. At that time Russia did not react aggressively, despite the fact that it was expected. And today, what's happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and also even a peace treaty signed, I don't think that it is going to lead some sort of confrontation between Azerbaijan, Armenia on one side, and Russia on the other side.
It's very interesting you said about Russia and about the expectations surrounding Russian removal from the region or decrease in Russian footprint. I vividly recall you and I chatting about Lachen border checkpoint. I think we were somewhere in one of the regions of Azerbaijan. We were discussing whether Azerbaijan would establish border checkpoint at the entrance of the Lachen road. It was just a month before. We had some fundamental doubts about the unilateral action. And then, of course, that happened. and then there were many other developments during the summer of 2023. Then there was an anti-terror operation in Karabakh in September 2023. And then, of course, the withdrawal of Russian troops, I think in April 2024. After what happened in Karabakh in September, were you absolutely sure, without any doubt whatsoever, that Russia would be forced by virtue of the circumstance on the ground to withdraw from Karabakh well in advance of the deadline set by the 10 November declaration?
You know, it was not expected, but retrospectively in October 2023, President Vladimir Putin talked about the future of Russia's presence in Karabakh, and he somehow hinted that Russia would at some point take out its peacekeeping forces from Karabakh. And President Putin understood very well that Russian peacekeepers were there to ensure security, particularly because Armenian community was still there. And after they voluntarily left Karabakh, there was no need left for Russian peacekeepers to stay there. So, you know, this is the reason why I don't expect Russia would react aggressively to present developments. I watched your program yesterday between Zaur Shiriev, Armenian Pashinyan, and also yesterday's program with Ahmed Ali. I see a lot of people are expecting that Russia is going to react in an aggressive way. Russia is unhappy, but I am skeptical about that. And one point very important in this context is concerning Zangezur Corridor. Some sources, particularly Armenian sources, claim that some American company is about to take control of Zangezur Corridor instead of Russia's border security guards. I am also very skeptical about that because, you know, if you remember in April last year when President Ilham Aliyev talked about the Zangezur Corridor, he said that some international presence is important to have there in order to ensure security of passengers and cargo passing through Zangezur Corridor. But very interestingly, for the first time, he talked about some international presence, not specifically Russia's border security guards, but international presence. At that time, he didn't elaborate on this point, but it was somehow hint that something may happen which would exclude Russia's FSP from...
And what would that international presence entail?
You know, according to the recent media reports, it's an American company which is going to be involved in this context, but I'm very skeptical about it. You know, it would be a very provocative geopolitical move against Russia if Armenia and Azerbaijan exclude Russia from Zangezur Corridor, despite the fact that Russia is natural there, according to trilateral statement of November 2020. So it would be a geopolitical provocation, and therefore, rather than some American company, I would expect some international organization or some international mission to be deployed to Zangezur Corridor, because it is very clear the Armenian side is very reluctant to get Russia deployed to Zangezur Corridor. Particularly over the past several months, the relations between Russia and Armenia have deteriorated significantly. And against this backdrop, it is unlikely that the Armenian government, led by Prime Minister Pashinyan, would agree to the deployment of Russia's border security guards to Zangezur Corridor. But some international mission, some international company might be accepted by the Armenian side as well. And it's very important to consider that President Ilham Aliyev also talked about this possibility, and still last year, in April last year, it didn't catch lots of attention at that time because it was not clear what was going on. But as the situation is now unfolding, it is clear what he might have meant at that time.
So you might have said international presence, and retrospectively we, by means of analyzing what has happened since then, could actually interpret true intent of what he meant back then.
Exactly.
It's very interesting. So back in November 2020, as a result of the 44-day war, this Zangezur Corridor project was became part of the sort of peace agenda between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan needed, of course, and still needs overland passage connecting its mainland with Nakhchivan exclave. Armenia agreed to Russian control back then. I mean, the 10 November declaration, Article 9 says very clearly who should control the road, and Armenia agreed to that. Then in January 2021, the working group, trilateral working group involving 3 countries, was established. What's about that group? I mean, that group still sort of functional. I mean, but should that be disbanded, and if so, how?
You know, there was no announcement about the group, whether it was disbanded or not yet, but the group was being attended by deputy prime ministers from both Armenia and Azerbaijan. From the Azerbaijani side, it was Shahin Mustafayev, from Armenian side, Armen Grigoryan. And it's very important that today both politicians are in Abu Dhabi as part of the delegation, official
delegations. Are very extensive. We have leaders, we have deputy foreign ministers dealing with delimitation, demarcation, opening of communications as well. We got
deputy prime ministers.
Deputy prime ministers. Yeah. What did I say?
Yeah, foreign ministers.
No, deputy prime ministers dealing with delimitation and demarcation, and also, of course, opening of communications. We got foreign ministers naturally. We got presidential assistant Hikmet Hajiyev and the head of the National Security Council, Armen Grigoryan. We got Ambassador Elchin Amirbayev, special representative of the Azerbaijani president, and also Ruben Rubinyan, particularly dealing with Turkish-Armenian normalization. That's the full scope of Azerbaijani-Armenian agenda, which is absolutely fascinating.
Exactly, and it shows that the sides are discussing all aspects of normalization of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations, and this is the reason why the discussions, negotiations are taking so long. And it shows that actually we are very close to a comprehensive agreement, to a peace deal, but still there is a but that the constitutional impediments in Armenia are going to prevent the document to be signed. You know, it's politics. You can never say never. Something may happen. The sides can find some modifications, some regulations to deal with that issue as well. But still, according to what we have at the moment, what's said by officials of both sides, particularly by the Azerbaijani side, that peace treaty is not going to be signed until Armenia changes.
Yeah, let me just, since you mentioned about the timing of the peace treaty being potentially signed, and you suggesting that it will probably not be signed before that constitutional issue resolved. Zaur Shariev's article published 2 months ago argues that, and it's entitled as Precarious Power of Azerbaijan, that main argument in that particular article is that if the peace treaty is not signed as soon as it's possible, this new emerging regional order will be endangered, and that regional order is effectively based on Azerbaijan's victory over Armenia, which attained its conclusive shape in September 2023. And then Arek Pashinyan in one of our interviews said that not signing peace deal now will be the crime against humanity. So another layer of urgency. Presidential aide Hikmet Hajiyev very recently, when I think he was attending the event, I think in Budapest or Prague, talked about post-2023 status quo based on legitimacy, rule of law, international law, and compared this current international status quo, regional status quo, to that existed before 2020, which was based on occupation. Do you think it is safe to carry on like this without signing a deal, just simply working on different tracks and not precipitating the actual signing of the deal?
Let me start with what you said about the security order in the South Caucasus. I am, in my analysis, I am very much focused on that issue, and it is a fact. The Second Karabakh War shifted the regional security order. And since that time, something new is emerging, but it hasn't emerged yet.
Yes.
We are in the process of the emergence of new security order. And over the past 5 years, a lot of new developments took place, which somehow shifted the ongoing process of regional security orders emergence. If you remember, in the wake of the Second Karabakh War, there were discussions that the new order in the South Caucasus was going to be based on 3+3 format, which meant that Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, plus Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And there were a couple of meetings in that framework, and also recently, if you remember, Russian officials talked about the new meeting in that format, together either in the capital of Armenia or in Azerbaijan. So it was the crux of the new security order that was supposed to emerge after Second Karabakh War. But the situation changed dramatically. The balance of power shifted dramatically. After the Russia's war against Ukraine, and also after the collapse of the separatist regime, the regional security order again transformed, and Azerbaijan particularly found itself in much stronger position in a way that Azerbaijan now feels it can lead the security situation of the South Caucasus, holding the regional ownership of the region, and also together with other countries of the South Caucasus, with Armenia and Azerbaijan. And today's meeting is showing that Armenian government is now accepting this regional vision of the Azerbaijan side. It is no coincidence that last month, before this meeting, and in the context of this Abu Dhabi meeting negotiations, Armenian Prime Minister also visited Istanbul and met with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And after this meeting, a couple of days ago, President Erdogan said that Pashinyan has been more flexible towards the Zangezur Corridor negotiations. So it shows that something new is emerging in the region, and it's very important. It's a fortunate moment for us that Azerbaijan is now in the leading position.
Should we intensify its emergence, or could we wait for the time being?
No, Azerbaijan has been, under the leadership of President Ilham Aliyev, has been very pragmatic, predictable, stable geopolitical actor, which is the reason why, Armenian government is now, pushing the peace treaty signing, but they often forget the fact that it was Azerbaijani government who proposed the peace treaty.
In March 2022.
In March 2022. It was a very...
and the reason why negotiations are currently bilateral, it was a result of the initiative taken by Azerbaijan. Exactly. Because you remember the famous Armenian ambassador at large, Edmond Manukyan, was constantly talking about the necessity of guarantor, mediator, third party, the lack of trust. And of course, Armenians themselves and Azerbaijani analysts, external observers, all accept the fact that bilateral nature of the negotiation is a product of the actions taken by Azerbaijan. Of course, the sense of urgency is another matter. You referred to the turning point, September, October 2023. We talked about the regional order, which is, as you said, has been emerging, in the process of emerging since November 2020. Exactly. And it will, at some point, assume its definable shape. And the contours of that shape are being made now, are in the making at this very juncture. Vasif, I'm so grateful to you for your time. It's a fascinating subject, and it's absolutely a great privilege to discuss it with a person of your caliber who knows a great deal about the subject, who has been following these developments rigorously with painstaking dedication over the past 5 years. And it was a great pleasure to converse with you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Well, today I've conversed with Dr. Vasif Huseynov, head of the department at the Center for Analysis of International Relations. We discussed the meeting between President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan in Abu Dhabi. And we have been informed, according to government sources, Ilham Aliyev, President of Azerbaijan, his meeting with Nikol Pashinyan was held in a very constructive atmosphere. So constructive atmosphere is one important factor. And of course, discussions were substantive. They relate to different aspects of the peace agenda. Of course, border delimitation and demarcation, opening of communications, with particular emphasis on the Zangezur Corridor, also a very, very, very importantly initialing of the peace treaty and other issues, because this matter should be taken into account. There's one thing to sign the peace deal, to sign the peace treaty, which is one particular aspect. Initialing the peace treaty without this treaty being in need of ratification is another issue. And I think that this particular moment, the latter moment which I mentioned, as I'm being informed, is going to be described as probably the most important achievement attained today. And of course, as we know, general agreement was attained to continue these contacts and negotiations, both at the level of various working groups and at higher possible levels indeed. We are in the presence of very important developments. You have been watching Context, and see you very soon indeed.